There's a kind of pain that rarely gets talked about when it comes to physical intimacy, a confusing, quiet kind of pain that exists beneath the surface of relationships where someone deeply craves closeness, yet somehow struggles the moment that closeness becomes real. And if you've ever been connected to someone who pulled you in emotionally one moment, only to become distant, tense, or emotionally unavailable the next, then you already know how heartbreaking and confusing that experience can feel. Because from the outside, it doesn't make sense. How can someone want love so badly and still struggle with touch, affection, vulnerability, or physical closeness once it begins to deepen? How can someone look at you with longing, crave your presence, miss you when you're gone, and yet freeze emotionally when intimacy becomes too real? This is one of the deepest inner conflicts fearful avoidance experience, and most people misunderstand it completely. People often assume their distance means they don't care enough, that they're emotionally cold, uninterested, or detached. But the truth is often far more complicated than that. In many cases, fearful avoidants don't struggle with physical intimacy because they feel too little. They struggle because they feel too much, and that's the part no one sees. Because beneath the withdrawal, beneath the mixed signals, beneath the emotional inconsistency, there is usually a nervous system caught between two powerful desires that are constantly fighting each other. The desire to feel safe in love and the fear of what love might eventually do to them. So when physical intimacy begins to deepen, it doesn't just activate attraction or affection. It activates vulnerability, exposure, emotional dependency, fear, memories, unresolved pain, the possibility of abandonment, the possibility of rejection, and the possibility of losing themselves inside the connection. And suddenly, something that should feel comforting begins to feel emotionally dangerous instead. That's why fearful avoidance can appear deeply connected one moment and emotionally shut down the next. It's why they may crave affection but tense up once they receive too much of it, why they can initiate closeness and then retreat right after, why they sometimes disappear emotionally after moments that felt deeply intimate and meaningful. And if you've experienced this with someone, you may have spent endless nights wondering what changed. You replayed the moments in your head, the affection, the chemistry, the vulnerability, the closeness. You felt them open up and then suddenly pull away as if something invisible inside them got triggered. And what makes this especially painful is that fearful avoidants often don't fully understand it themselves. They feel the internal conflict happening inside them, but they struggle to explain it. Because part of them genuinely wants the connection, while another part is terrified of what that connection could eventually cost emotionally. So they live trapped in a cycle that feels exhausting not only for their partners, but for them too. A cycle where intimacy feels both beautiful and terrifying at the exact same time. And the deeper the emotional connection becomes, the harder it often gets for them to stay emotionally regulated inside it. Because physical intimacy is never just physical for fearful avoidance. It becomes emotional exposure. It becomes emotional risk. It becomes the moment where someone might finally see the parts of them they've spent years trying to protect. And that fear runs far deeper than most people realize. For fearful avoidance, physical intimacy can feel emotionally dangerous in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it internally. Because while many people experience closeness as grounding and comforting, fearful avoidants often experience it as emotionally activating. Their nervous system doesn't simply interpret intimacy as connection. It can also interpret it as vulnerability, unpredictability, and emotional exposure. That's why moments that should feel safe can suddenly create internal panic. A hug that lasts too long, a moment of eye contact filled with emotion, a deep conversation after physical closeness, affection that feels too real. These moments can unconsciously trigger fear inside them because intimacy removes emotional distance. And emotional distance is often what helped them feel safe for most of their lives. When someone gets emotionally close enough to touch their heart deeply, the fearful avoidant nervous system begins asking dangerous questions beneath the surface. What if I get attached? What if they leave later? What if I lose control emotionally? What if I need them too much? What if this eventually hurts me? And those fears don't always show up consciously. Sometimes they appear through subtle withdrawal, emotional numbness, avoidance, tension, silence, sudden emotional confusion, or a strange urge to create space after moments of connection. This is why fearful avoidance can seem so contradictory in relationships. They may genuinely desire closeness, but once closeness arrives, fear arrives with it, and that internal conflict creates enormous emotional confusion, not only for them, but for the people trying to love them. Because the partner often experiences emotional whiplash. One moment the fearful avoidant is deeply affectionate, emotionally open, physically connected, fully present. The next moment, they become distant, harder to reach, emotionally quiet, overwhelmed and detached. And the partner begins wondering if they imagined the connection entirely. But what's often happening internally is not a loss of feeling, it's emotional overload. The connection became too emotionally real, too vulnerable, too exposing, and their nervous system instinctively responded by pulling back to regain emotional safety. That's the painful irony of fearful avoidance. The very thing they long for most can also become the thing that activates their deepest fears. And because physical intimacy creates emotional closeness faster than words alone, it often becomes one of the strongest emotional triggers for them, especially when genuine feelings are involved, especially when attachment begins forming, especially when they realize they actually care deeply. Because once emotional attachment becomes real, so does the fear of loss. And many fearful avoidants learned early in life that love and pain often arrive together, which is why they frequently struggle to simply relax into connection, even when they want to, even when they care deeply, even when the relationship means everything to them. And one of the most misunderstood truths about fearful avoidance is this: many of them actually crave intimacy more deeply than people realize. They are not emotionless, they are not incapable of love. In fact, many fearful avoidants long intensely for emotional and physical closeness. They fantasize about deep connection, stability, safe affection, emotional security, being fully understood, being chosen consistently, and being loved in a way that finally feels calm instead of painful. But fantasy feels safer than reality. Because fantasy can't abandon them, fantasy can't betray them, fantasy can't expose their wounds, real intimacy can. And that's where the internal struggle begins. A fearful avoidant may spend days longing for someone's touch, presence, affection, and reassurance, but once they actually receive it, another part of them becomes activated. A protective part, a fearful part, a hypervigilant part that starts scanning for emotional danger beneath the connection. That's why they may suddenly become emotionally inconsistent after moments of closeness. Not because the intimacy meant nothing, but because it meant too much, and when emotions become too intense, fearful avoidants often feel internally flooded by vulnerability. They don't fully know how to regulate, so instead of leaning deeper into connection, they instinctively create distance, sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally, sometimes mentally, sometimes through silence, sometimes through confusion. And one of the saddest parts is that they often hate this pattern inside themselves. They wish they could simply enjoy love without fear interrupting it. They wish closeness didn't trigger anxiety. They wish physical intimacy didn't create such emotional chaos internally. But unresolved attachment wounds are powerful, especially when closeness itself became associated with emotional unpredictability early in life. Because many fearful avoidants were not taught that love was consistently safe. They were taught inconsistency, mixed emotional signals, unpredictable affection, moments of closeness followed by emotional withdrawal, care mixed with pain, connection mixed with fear, so their nervous system adapted accordingly. Love became something they wanted desperately, but also something they learned to brace themselves against emotionally. And this conditioning often begins far earlier than people realize. For many fearful avoidants, childhood created a confusing emotional blueprint around intimacy and connection. The people they depended on emotionally may have been loving at times, but emotionally unavailable, unpredictable, critical, neglectful, overwhelming, or inconsistent at other times. As a result, closeness stopped feeling fully safe, because the same person who provided comfort may have also caused emotional pain, and when that happens repeatedly, the nervous system learns something devastating. Love is not stable, love is unpredictable, love can disappear suddenly, and love can hurt. So the child grows up longing for connection, while simultaneously fearing it. And that fear doesn't simply disappear in adulthood. It follows them into relationships, into vulnerability, into emotional attachment, and into physical intimacy. Because physical closeness activates emotional memories stored far beneath conscious awareness. Not always specific memories people can verbally explain, but emotional imprints their nervous system still carries. That's why fearful avoidants may react strongly to intimacy without fully understanding why themselves. Their body remembers emotional danger, even when their conscious mind wants love, so they end up trapped between desire and self-protection. One part says, "Finally, this feels real." Another part whispers, "Be careful, don't trust this too much." And when those two voices collide internally, relationships can become emotionally exhausting. Not because the connection lacks meaning, but because intimacy forces fearful avoidants to confront the very wounds they've spent years trying to protect themselves from feeling again. And the deeper the connection becomes, the louder those fears often grow. And the hardest part about all of this is that beneath the distance fearful avoidants create, there is often an enormous fear of rejection silently controlling their behavior. A fear so deep that many of them begin preparing for abandonment long before anything has actually gone wrong. That's why even during moments of connection, a part of them may already be anticipating loss. They notice small changes in tone, small shifts in energy, a delayed text, a different expression, or a moment where affection feels slightly less intense than before. And while these moments may seem minor to others, the fearful avoidant nervous system often interprets them as potential warning signs. Because deep down, many fearful avoidants learned early in life that emotional safety could disappear unexpectedly. So instead of fully relaxing into love, they stay emotionally alert, watching, scanning, and preparing. Not because they want to sabotage the connection, but because they are terrified of being blindsided emotionally. And this creates one of the most painful relationship dynamics imaginable. They crave reassurance, yet struggle to trust it completely. They want closeness, yet fear becoming emotionally dependent on it. They want to believe someone will stay, yet part of them is always waiting for the moment things change. So when physical intimacy deepens, their fear of rejection often intensifies too, because intimacy creates attachment, and attachment creates emotional risk. The more someone matters to them, the more power that person suddenly has to hurt them emotionally, and that realization can feel terrifying, which is why fearful avoidants sometimes begin pulling away right after moments that seem deeply connected, not because the connection was fake, but because it suddenly became emotionally important. And importance feels dangerous when you've spent your life associating love with pain. That's why some fearful avoidants unconsciously reject people before they themselves can be rejected. They create distance before vulnerability becomes complete. They emotionally retreat before attachment feels irreversible, because if they stay emotionally detached enough, they believe the pain will hurt less later. But what they rarely realize is that this self-protection often creates the exact loneliness they were trying to avoid in the first place. And deep down, many of them know it. Many fearful avoidants secretly carry heartbreak, not only from relationships that ended, but from relationships they themselves struggled to fully receive while they still had them. Because there were moments where they wanted to lean in emotionally, moments where they wanted to trust, moments where they wanted to stop running from closeness. But fear interrupted the process every time vulnerability became too intense. And over time, that creates enormous emotional exhaustion inside them. Because constantly protecting yourself from love also means constantly protecting yourself from the very connection you desperately need. And eventually, the loneliness begins to catch up with them emotionally, especially during quiet moments, especially after distance, especially after someone finally walks away. That's often when the fearful avoidant begins realizing how deeply they actually felt all along. Because once the connection is gone, the fear temporarily quiets down, and the grief finally surfaces underneath it. And the grief can feel overwhelming, not only because they lost someone important, but because part of them wonders whether their fear destroyed something they truly wanted. Another reason fearful avoidants struggle so deeply with physical intimacy is because they often cannot fully relax during emotionally vulnerable moments. Even when things appear calm externally, there may be intense emotional activity happening internally beneath the surface. Overthinking, self-monitoring, emotional tension, fear of saying or doing the wrong thing, fear of becoming too emotionally exposed, fear of losing control over their emotions. So while their body may physically be present, their nervous system is often still bracing for emotional danger in the background. This is why physical affection can sometimes feel emotionally overwhelming instead of comforting to them. Because closeness requires surrender, presence, and trust. And for someone whose nervous system learned to survive through emotional self-protection, surrendering fully into intimacy can feel incredibly difficult. Many fearful avoidants are constantly analyzing themselves during vulnerable moments. How am I being perceived? Am I becoming too attached? What if they lose interest? What if I disappoint them? What if they eventually leave once they truly know me? So instead of simply experiencing intimacy emotionally, part of their mind stays hyper-alert, and hypervigilance makes emotional relaxation nearly impossible. This is also why fearful avoidance may appear emotionally disconnected after moments that should feel bonding. The intensity of the vulnerability becomes difficult to regulate internally, so their nervous system responds by creating emotional distance afterward to calm itself back down. Sometimes this looks like silence, sometimes distraction, sometimes emotional numbness, sometimes becoming colder or less expressive, sometimes suddenly needing space without fully understanding why. And if you've experienced this from someone you loved, it likely hurt deeply because the shift feels so confusing, especially after moments that felt genuine, especially after affection that felt real. You begin wondering if you imagined the connection entirely. But often the fearful avoidant did feel it, very deeply. The problem is not always the absence of emotion. The problem is their difficulty staying emotionally safe while experiencing that emotion. Because for fearful avoidance, intimacy often activates vulnerability faster than their nervous system knows how to handle. And underneath all of this, shame quietly shapes far more of their intimate behavior than most people realize. Shame is one of the deepest hidden wounds many fearful avoidants carry. Not always obvious shame, not always conscious shame, but the quiet feeling that something about them is emotionally flawed, unsafe, unworthy, too complicated, or too difficult to fully love. And when someone gets physically close enough to emotionally see them, that shame often becomes activated, because intimacy removes emotional hiding places. It creates exposure, and exposure terrifies the parts of them that secretly fear rejection. That's why many fearful avoidants struggle to fully believe they are lovable, even when someone genuinely cares for them. Part of them keeps waiting for disappointment, keeps waiting for the other person to eventually realize they are too much, too emotional, too distant, too complicated, too damaged, or somehow not enough. And when someone carries that kind of internal shame, physical intimacy can become emotionally loaded in ways that are difficult to explain outwardly. Affection becomes vulnerable, touch becomes exposing, eye contact becomes intense. Because underneath the closeness there is often a quiet fear whispering, if they truly see all of me, will they still stay? That fear alone can create enormous emotional tension during intimacy. And sometimes, fearful avoidants disconnect emotionally, not because they don't care, but because closeness activates the parts of themselves they feel ashamed of most, their fears, their dependency needs, their emotional sensitivity, their longing, their wounds, the very things they spent years hiding to survive emotionally. And this becomes even more complicated when past trauma enters the picture. Because trauma can deeply disconnect a person from their ability to feel safe inside their own body during intimacy. For some fearful avoidants, emotional pain became so overwhelming earlier in life that their nervous system learned to survive through emotional shutdown, numbing, detachment, dissociation, and disconnection. These responses are not intentional cruelty. They are protective adaptations, ways the nervous system learned to reduce emotional overwhelm when vulnerability felt unbearable. So during physical intimacy, fearful avoidants may sometimes suddenly feel emotionally absent, even when they genuinely care about the person they're with, not because the connection lacks meaning, but because closeness itself activated survival responses stored deeply in the nervous system, and that can create profound confusion and guilt inside them afterward. Because part of them desperately wants connection, while another part instinctively shuts down the moment vulnerability becomes too intense. And many fearful avoidants silently hate this about themselves. They don't want to keep pulling away, they don't want to struggle with closeness, they don't want affection to feel emotionally overwhelming. But unresolved trauma patterns are powerful, especially when intimacy itself became associated with emotional pain, unpredictability, or loss. Which is why some fearful avoidants spend years trapped in cycles they don't fully understand themselves, wanting love, finding it, feeling it, then panicking once it becomes emotionally real. And perhaps one of the deepest fears underneath all of this is not simply intimacy itself, it's what intimacy could eventually lead to. Because for fearful avoidants, closeness is rarely experienced as just a moment. Their nervous system often immediately jumps ahead emotionally into future possibilities. What if I become attached? What if this relationship changes me? What if they become my emotional safe place and then disappear? What if I lose myself emotionally? What if this eventually breaks me? This is why physical intimacy can trigger future-focused anxiety in fearful avoidance, even during moments that appear loving and secure externally. Because intimacy creates emotional investment, and emotional investment creates vulnerability to loss. The deeper the connection becomes, the harder it feels to emotionally protect themselves from potential heartbreak later. So instead of allowing themselves to fully sink into love, part of them stays guarded, preparing, controlling, holding back emotionally, and trying not to fall too deep. Because deep attachment feels dangerous to people who learned that love can disappear unexpectedly. And sometimes, fearful avoidants become terrified not only of abandonment, but of how deeply they might emotionally unravel if abandonment actually happened. So they try to maintain emotional control at all costs. But intimacy naturally softens emotional defenses, which means the closer they become to someone, the more vulnerable they begin to feel internally. And that vulnerability can feel both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Because beneath every fearful avoidant is usually someone who deeply wants love, but is terrified of the emotional power love has over them once they finally allow themselves to feel it fully. And this is why fearful avoidants often send mixed signals that leave the people closest to them emotionally exhausted and confused. Because from the outside, their behavior can feel impossible to understand. One day they seem deeply connected, affectionate, emotionally vulnerable, and fully present. Their walls come down. Their warmth feels genuine. You feel chosen by them in a way that touches something deep inside you. And then suddenly, something shifts. Their energy changes. The affection softens, the emotional openness disappears, texts become shorter, distance quietly enters the connection again, and the person on the receiving end is left trying to figure out what happened. Was it something they said, something they did? Did the feeling suddenly disappear? But what many people fail to understand is that fearful avoidants are often battling an internal emotional storm beneath those shifts. The inconsistency is usually not random, and it's not always manipulation either. It's fear colliding with attachment in real time. The closer they feel emotionally, the more vulnerable they become internally. And when vulnerability becomes overwhelming, their nervous system reacts by trying to restore emotional safety through distance. That's why fearful avoidance can appear emotionally torn between two completely opposite needs, the need for closeness and the need for protection. Part of them wants to stay in the intimacy, while the other part starts panicking because intimacy means emotional exposure. So they move closer, then farther away, open up, then shut down, reach for connection, then retreat from it. And these shifts can happen so quickly that even they struggle to understand their own reactions. Because fearful avoidance is not a calm emotional state, it's internal contradiction. It's wanting love while fearing it. It's longing for emotional safety while struggling to trust it. And perhaps the most painful part is that fearful avoidants often blame themselves for these patterns afterward. They know their inconsistency hurts people. They know their distance creates confusion. They know the push-pull dynamic damages relationships. But awareness alone does not instantly heal nervous system wounds that were built over years of emotional survival, especially when those wounds are rooted in past experiences, where closeness eventually led to pain. Because many fearful avoidants unconsciously associate love with emotional suffering, not intentionally, not logically, but emotionally. Deep in the nervous system, connection may still feel tied to betrayal, abandonment, criticism, emotional unpredictability, or heartbreak. And when someone carries that emotional blueprint long enough, the body begins responding to intimacy, as though pain is eventually inevitable. So even during happy moments, fear quietly lingers underneath. A fearful avoidant may be deeply enjoying someone's affection while simultaneously fearing the future loss of it. They may feel comforted by closeness while also emotionally bracing for disappointment later. That's why they often struggle to stay fully emotionally present inside loving moments. Part of them is already preparing for the hurt before the hurt even arrives, and this emotional anticipation creates enormous internal tension, because the more they care, the more they have to lose. The more attached they become, the more vulnerable they feel. And vulnerability has often been the doorway to pain in their past, so their nervous system starts trying to protect them before anything even goes wrong. This is why fearful avoidants sometimes sabotage connections that actually feel healthy. Not because healthy love feels bad, but because healthy love feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar vulnerability can feel terrifying when chaos, inconsistency, or emotional instability were once normalized. In many cases, fearful avoidants are more comfortable chasing unavailable love than peacefully receiving stable love, because chasing keeps emotional control partially intact, but receiving genuine intimacy requires surrender, trust, softness, and emotional openness, and those things can feel deeply unsafe to someone who learned early that emotional closeness often came with pain attached to it. So they unconsciously keep one foot emotionally outside the relationship, even while part of them desperately wants to come fully inside it. And when physical intimacy deepens, this emotional conflict intensifies even more, because physical touch has a way of bypassing emotional defenses faster than words ever could. A conversation can stay intellectual, controlled, and safe, but touch is different. Touch reaches the nervous system directly. It creates emotional presence, it softens emotional walls, it exposes longing, and for fearful avoidance, that level of emotional exposure can feel incredibly overwhelming, especially when genuine feelings are involved. Because vulnerability through physical intimacy often feels more intense than vulnerability through words alone. A fearful avoidant might be able to hide behind humor, distraction, silence, or emotional detachment in everyday interactions, but during moments of physical closeness, those protective layers often become harder to maintain, and suddenly they feel emotionally seen, not just physically touched, seen, felt, known, and that can trigger enormous fear internally, because many fearful avoidants spent years protecting the deepest parts of themselves from exposure, their pain, their dependency needs, their fear of abandonment, their emotional sensitivity, their longing to be loved safely. Physical intimacy threatens those emotional defenses because it creates moments where emotional distance disappears, even temporarily. And for someone terrified of emotional loss, closeness without distance can feel almost unbearable at times. That's why some fearful avoidants suddenly become emotionally overwhelmed right after deeply intimate moments, because the experience touched parts of them they usually keep guarded, parts they don't fully know how to regulate once activated. And afterward, their nervous system often scrambles to regain emotional control, sometimes through withdrawal, sometimes through silence, sometimes through emotional detachment, sometimes through convincing themselves they suddenly need space. But beneath that space is often fear. Fear of attachment, fear of dependence, fear of losing emotional control, fear of eventually being hurt by how deeply they care. And perhaps one of the most heartbreaking parts of fearful avoidance is that many fearful avoidants secretly test emotional safety without fully realizing they're doing it, not always through obvious games, but through emotional patterns shaped by fear. They may pull away to see whether someone chases them. They may become distant to see who remains emotionally patient. They may unconsciously create space because part of them needs reassurance that the connection is stable enough to survive distance. Because deep down, many fearful avoidants are trying to answer one painful question: if I stop protecting myself for a moment, will you still stay? And that question influences far more of their behavior than most people realize. Sometimes they test emotional safety by becoming quieter, sometimes by withdrawing physically, sometimes by becoming emotionally confusing, sometimes by hesitating during intimacy itself, not because they want to hurt someone, but because their nervous system is searching for signs of danger or reassurance beneath the connection. The tragedy is that reassurance often helps temporarily, but doesn't fully heal the wound underneath. Because attachment wounds cannot be healed through words alone, the nervous system needs repeated experiences of consistency, emotional safety, patience, and trust before it slowly begins relaxing its defenses. And until that happens, fearful avoidants often remain trapped between longing for intimacy and fearing it simultaneously. They want closeness, but they fear what closeness awakens inside them emotionally. And this is where many people misunderstand fearful avoidance entirely. People often separate emotional intimacy and physical intimacy as though they are completely different things. But for fearful avoidance, they are deeply connected. Physical intimacy without emotional safety often feels overwhelming because physical closeness naturally creates emotional vulnerability, and emotional vulnerability is the exact place where fearful avoidants feel least safe. That's why emotional trust matters so much to them, even if they struggle to admit it openly. When they feel emotionally safe with someone, truly safe, their entire relationship to intimacy can slowly begin changing. The tension softens, the hypervigilance decreases, their body begins relaxing instead of bracing, their nervous system slowly stops interpreting closeness as danger. But emotional safety requires consistency, not intensity, not emotional chaos, not pressure, consistency, calmness, predictability, patience, because fearful avoidants often grew up in environments where affection felt unpredictable, so their nervous system learned to expect sudden emotional shifts even in love. That's why stable affection can feel unfamiliar at first, even suspicious, but over time, repeated emotional safety begins creating something they may have rarely experienced before: trust without fear, closeness without panic, affection without emotional danger. And when that begins happening, fearful avoidants often discover that their struggle was never about an inability to love deeply. It was about how unsafe love once felt inside them emotionally. Because beneath the avoidance, beneath the fear, beneath the withdrawal, there is usually someone who has spent their entire life wanting the very thing they struggle most to fully receive: safe love, safe intimacy, safe closeness. Not love that disappears, not affection mixed with fear, not connection filled with emotional unpredictability, just safety. And when they finally begin experiencing that consistently, something inside them slowly starts changing in ways they never thought were possible. And yet, even when fearful avoidants begin experiencing safe love, the old survival patterns do not disappear overnight. Because avoidance was never simply a habit, it was protection. Protection built over years of emotional pain, disappointment, confusion, and fear. A system the nervous system created to survive vulnerability, when vulnerability once felt unsafe. So when fearful avoidants withdraw after moments of deep intimacy, it's important to understand something most people never realize. Their distance is often not about the absence of feelings, it's about the intensity of them. Sometimes the connection becomes so emotionally powerful that their nervous system automatically tries to create space just to regulate itself again. And this is where so many relationships begin falling apart. Because one person experiences intimacy and wants to move closer emotionally afterward, while the fearful avoidant experiences intimacy and suddenly feels overwhelmed by how vulnerable they've become. So the closer the relationship gets, the more internal conflict starts surfacing inside them. Part of them feels relief, comfort, attachment, and hope, but another part starts panicking. What if this changes? What if they eventually hurt me? What if I lose myself in this relationship? What if I become too dependent emotionally? And because those fears feel so intense internally, withdrawal becomes their way of regaining emotional control. Sometimes they need silence, sometimes distance, sometimes distraction, sometimes emotional numbness, not because they stopped caring, but because caring became emotionally overwhelming. And unfortunately, this creates the exact misunderstanding that hurts both people involved. The partner feels rejected, unwanted, and emotionally abandoned, while the fearful avoidant often feels flooded, guilty, confused, and ashamed for needing distance after closeness. It becomes a painful cycle neither side fully understands, because from the outside withdrawal looks cold, but internally it often feels chaotic. Many fearful avoidants are not calmly detached when they pull away. They are internally overwhelmed, torn between attachment and fear, longing and panic, love and self-protection. And perhaps one of the most heartbreaking truths is that many fearful avoidants silently carry enormous guilt for the pain their patterns create in relationships, even if they rarely express it openly. They replay moments afterward, the distance they created, the affection they struggled to sustain, the confusion in the other person's eyes, the emotional walls they couldn't lower fully, and deep down many of them fear that they are incapable of maintaining the very love they desperately want. That fear alone creates incredible emotional sadness inside them, because contrary to how they may appear externally, many fearful avoidants are deeply emotional people. They feel deeply, love deeply, miss deeply, grieve deeply, but they often struggle to regulate the vulnerability that comes with those emotions. So instead of staying fully emotionally present, they instinctively retreat once intimacy reaches a certain intensity. And afterward, the guilt quietly follows them, especially when they realize someone genuinely cared about them, especially when they recognize the connection was real, especially when they know their fear created distance they didn't truly want. Some fearful avoidants spend years trapped in this cycle, meeting people they care about, feeling connection, then slowly sabotaging intimacy the moment it becomes emotionally meaningful. And over time, this creates an unbearable kind of loneliness, because eventually they begin realizing that the walls protecting them from pain are also protecting them from love. And that realization hurts more than most people understand, especially during quiet moments alone, especially after relationships end, especially when they think about the people they pushed away not because they felt nothing, but because they felt too much and didn't know how to handle it safely. That's why healing fearful avoidance is not about forcing vulnerability. It's about creating enough emotional safety that vulnerability no longer feels like emotional danger. And healing begins slowly, not dramatically, not perfectly, but gradually. It begins when the nervous system starts learning that closeness does not automatically lead to pain, that love can remain steady, that emotional intimacy does not always end in abandonment, that physical affection can feel calming instead of threatening, and that someone can stay emotionally consistent without suddenly disappearing. But this kind of healing requires experiences that directly challenge old emotional conditioning, consistency instead of unpredictability, patience instead of pressure, calmness instead of emotional chaos, safety instead of emotional games, because fearful avoidance do not heal through force, they heal through repeated emotional experiences that slowly teach the nervous system a new reality, a reality where love does not have to be earned through suffering, a reality where intimacy does not require losing yourself emotionally, a reality where vulnerability does not automatically end in heartbreak. And one of the biggest turning points in healing happens when fearful avoidants begin understanding their own patterns with compassion instead of shame, because shame keeps people trapped. Shame says there's something wrong with me, I ruin relationships, I'm too damaged to love properly. But healing begins when they realize their behaviors were survival responses, not proof of emotional brokenness. Their nervous system adapted to emotional environments that taught them closeness could be unsafe. And while those adaptations may no longer serve them now, they once protected them emotionally. Understanding that changes everything, because self-awareness allows fearful avoidance to finally pause during moments of emotional overwhelm. Instead of automatically running from intimacy every time fear appears, they begin recognizing the difference between danger and vulnerability. And that distinction is life-changing, because vulnerability is not the same as danger. Attachment is not weakness, needing love is not failure. Wanting closeness is not something to be ashamed of, and the more fearful avoidants begin emotionally accepting these truths, the more their relationship with intimacy slowly transforms. Not overnight, but little by little, they start tolerating closeness without panicking as quickly. They communicate fears instead of disappearing immediately. They recognize when old wounds are being triggered. They stop interpreting every emotional connection as a future threat, and slowly, intimacy becomes less terrifying. Not because fear completely vanishes, but because safety begins growing stronger than fear. And what fearful avoidants need most during this process is often not perfection from another person. It's emotional safety, real safety, the kind that feels calm instead of chaotic, predictable instead of inconsistent, patient instead of demanding. Because pressure often intensifies their defenses, but safety softens them. When they feel emotionally rushed, judged, controlled, or emotionally trapped, their nervous system immediately moves back into self-protection. But when they feel emotionally understood, when they feel accepted without being forced open, when they feel safe enough to move at a pace their nervous system can handle, something inside them slowly begins relaxing. And this doesn't mean tolerating unhealthy behavior forever. It doesn't mean abandoning your own emotional needs. It simply means understanding that fearful avoidants often respond far more to emotional safety than emotional pressure. Because beneath their defenses is usually someone who has spent most of their life terrified that love would eventually hurt them. So they need consistency more than intensity, gentleness more than force, honest communication more than emotional mind games, reassurance without suffocation, and space without abandonment. And perhaps most importantly, they need relationships where they no longer feel punished for being emotionally human. Because many fearful avoidants secretly learned that vulnerability came with consequences, that emotional needs created rejection, and that closeness created pain. Healing begins when those beliefs are finally challenged by healthier emotional experiences. And maybe the deepest truth of all, the truth fearful avoidants rarely say out loud, is this: they are not avoiding intimacy because they don't feel deeply enough. Most of the time, they are avoiding it because they feel it too deeply. The touch means too much, the closeness means too much, the attachment feels too powerful, the vulnerability feels too exposing, and the possibility of losing someone they truly love feels emotionally devastating before loss has even happened. So they protect themselves, withdraw, hesitate, create distance, not because love is absent, but because love feels emotionally overwhelming inside them. And once you truly understand that, you begin seeing fearful avoidance differently. You begin realizing that beneath the walls, beneath the silence, beneath the mixed signals and emotional confusion, there is often someone standing there quietly fighting a battle between fear and love every single day. A person who desperately wants connection, but whose nervous system still remembers what it felt like when connection once became pain. And maybe that's the real tragedy of fearful avoidance. Not that they cannot love, but that the very thing they long for most can sometimes feel like the very thing they must emotionally protect themselves from losing. Until one day, healing slowly teaches them something they may have never fully believed before, that love does not always have to hurt, that intimacy does not always end in abandonment, and that being emotionally close to someone can finally feel safe instead of frightening.